The wind carried with it the thin bite of high mountain air, mixed with the acrid scent of gunpowder, drifting from somewhere beyond the jagged ridgeline in front of her. Emma Phantom Roberts lay low against the cold rock, her body pressed tight to the earth, as if she could merge with it. Her breath was steady, controlled, not because she felt calm, but because years of training had taught her that panic was an enemy more dangerous than any bullet. The mountains of Afghanistan rose like ancient fortresses, their peaks dusted with snow, while the valleys between them were carved into 1,000 secret paths. Emma had been in these mountains for only a handful of days, yet she already felt their weight pressing in her mind. The enemy bunker she watched through the scope of her rifle had been the source of endless misery for her unit. 17 American soldiers gone in just 3 days, each death a sharp wound to morale and to the mission. At 26 years old, Emma was the youngest sniper in her Special Operations Unit. Her record was clean, her aim precise, but today her skill alone would not be enough. Colonel John Mitchell crouched beside her, his binoculars fixed on the fortified structure carved into the sheer face of the mountain. His voice carried a deep frustration as he spoke over the constant hum of distant gunfire. The place had become a bleeding wound in there. Advance, in every attempt to silence it had failed. Artillery shells burst harmlessly against the rock face. Helicopters searched for an angle, but the enemy's construction made them ghosts in the mist, untouchable. Emma studied the enemy hide with a patience learned long ago. Her scope brought every detail into sharp focus. Layers of rock had been turned into walls by human hands. Overlapping arcs of fire covered every approach. A normal assault would be suicidal. Her fellow soldiers whispered doubts around campfires about whether this position could even be touched. Major Sophia Lane stood with arms crossed, a frown etching deep lines into her face as she voiced the opinion of most. Emma was a sniper, not an explosives expert. This mission needed something bigger, something that could wipe out the entire structure in one violent breath. What no one here knew was that Emma carried within her mind a map of destruction that few alive had ever seen. Her father, Robert Ghost Roberts, had once been a legend whispered about in the far reaches of the military, a sniper whose precision had rewritten the rules of battlefield demolition during the Iraq War. He had developed a method of using carefully calculated rifle shots to collapse enemy fortifications without ever planting a single explosive. The details of his work were classified, locked away in vaults where only a handful of eyes would ever see them. Emma, however, had grown up in that world. She had learned under the watchful gaze of a man who saw buildings and bunkers not as impenetrable walls, but as puzzles waiting for the right move. Robert had taught her to see the geometry in every structure, to find the point where strength turned to fragility and where a single well-placed bullet could bring the whole thing down. Her lessons had been unconventional afternoons in dusty yards lined with wooden targets, mornings where she calculated angles and stress loads before she was even allowed to touch a rifle. She had never told her unit about this hidden knowledge. Part of her wanted to earn respect on her own. The other part feared they would laugh at the idea that a young sniper could know something their best engineers did not yet. As she watched the enemy bunker bristling with firepower, she understood that conventional thinking would not save them today. Colonel Mitchell shifted beside her, his gaze never leaving the bunker. His voice held the weight of frustration when he said they had already brought in structural analysts, and there was no way to take the position without heavy explosives, which they could not deliver. Emma's mind, however, was already dissecting the fortress layer by layer. Her father's voice lived in her memory, reminding her that every man-made modification to a natural structure created weakness. She traced the outline of a third-level machine gun nest, noticing how it jutted forward at an odd angle. The defenders had cut away rock to create a wider field of fire, and to keep the structure from collapsing, they had propped it up with thick wooden beams barely visible under the overhang. If those supports failed, the weight above would crumble like sand in a strong wind. From there, the collapse could spread upward, turning the fortress into its own undoing. Major Lane shook her head dismissively when Emma mentioned targeting the supports, insisting that rock did not collapse from a rifle shot. Emma knew she was not speaking of rock. She was speaking of the fragile skeleton hidden beneath the mountain skin, the braces, the beams, the points where human construction intersected with the stubborn permanence of stone. These were the places where physics could be turned into a weapon. Emma adjusted her scope, aligning it with the faint outline of the beams. She could see the stress lines in the structure, the subtle sag of weight pressing down. Over time, she knew that if she began the sequence, each shot would have to be perfect, and that the moment she fired the first round, every gun in that bunker would swing toward her. Her heart did not race, her hands did not shake. Instead, she felt the quiet focus her father had drilled into her since childhood. She thought not of danger, but of mathematics. The problem was one of timing, trajectory, and force. She would have only seconds to make the sequence work, and if she failed, the cost would be measured in lives and lost ground. Emma slid back from the scope for a moment, scanning the terrain for her firing position. The ridge, 800 meters out, would do. It offered enough cover to keep her from immediate detection, but was close enough for the surgical precision required. She began mentally mapping the supports, cataloging their order like pieces on a chessboard. Her father's voice again whispered in memory, telling her that the hardest shots were never about the distance, they were about understanding the outcome before pulling the trigger. As she crawled toward her position, the wind caught at her hair, and the smell of cordite lingered in the air behind her. The voices of her unit rose in clipped orders and radio chatter ahead of her. The mountain waited silent and ancient, daring her to try. Emma settled into position on the ridge, feeling the gritty stone beneath her elbows and the weight of her rifle pressed into her shoulder. The M24 was more than a tool in her hands. It was an extension of her thoughts and calculations. She adjusted the scope, turning the dials with the precision of someone who understood that every fraction of an inch could mean success or failure. The wind whispered across the mountaintop, teasing strands of hair across her vision, and she adjusted again, allowing for the subtle shift in air currents. She began the process her father Robert had taught her years ago, something he called structural mapping. Through her lens, the enemy fortress became a diagram in her mind. Every support beam, every load-bearing joint, every intersection where stone met steel, or what was a part of the puzzle. She traced imaginary lines through the complex, calculating how the weight would redistribute. If certain points were removed, the numbers formed silently in her mind: angles, force vectors, impact projections, and she felt the old comfort of turning chaos into equations. Over the radio, Colonel John Mitchell's voice came through, low and steady, asking if she was certain about what she was seeing. Emma responded with calm certainty, explaining that she had identified 7 critical supports that, if removed in the right order, would cause the collapse to cascade upward and take down the entire position. The colonel warned her that the moment she fired, they would have her position within seconds, and every weapon in that fortress would turn toward her. She knew this was true, but fear was not part of her calculation now. She thought of Robert's last lesson before his final deployment, the one where he told her that precision was not about distance or wind speed, but about knowing exactly what you wanted to achieve before you pulled the trigger. He had said that when everything depended on precision, you must trust the mathematics, because mathematics never lied. Those words became the rhythm of her heartbeat, now steady and measured against the roar of the wind. Emma steadied her breathing, placed her cheek against the rifle stock, and sighted her first target. It was a wooden beam on the 3rd level, barely visible through the shadows of the overhang. At 800 meters, the timber was only 6 inches thick, but it held the weight of an entire section of stone. Her finger tightened against the trigger, and the rifle bucked gently into her shoulder. The beam splintered instantly, the shot so precise that for a fraction of a second, nothing happened. Then the stone shelf above sagged just slightly, a sign that the first piece of the puzzle had shifted. Shouts echoed from the fortress, and enemy fighters began to move, scrambling to locate the threat. Emma ignored them. She was already swinging the barrel toward the second target, another beam on the same level, but on the opposite side. She fired again, the bullet cutting through. With surgical precision, the groan of stress stone reached her ears, even over the wind, as the weight began to shift more dramatically. Her third shot targeted a welded joint deep within a support frame. Metal rang like a bell as the bullet struck exactly where she had aimed. Fractures spiderwebbed outward from the impact. Racing through the surrounding stone, enemy gunfire erupted toward her position, but her focus had narrowed into a state her father had once called mathematical calm. In that place, there was no fear, only angles and timing. The fourth shot severed a load-bearing beam. Now, carrying the strain from the weakened structure above the result, was immediate. The stone shelf that had sagged earlier gave way, collapsing downward and smashing into the levels beneath. Dust and rock exploded outward, and the shouts from the fortress turned into chaos. Emma kept moving, never staying still for more than a second. She could feel bullets cutting the air around her, but her mind was locked into the sequence. The cascade unfolded exactly as Robert had taught her. Level 3 gave way, crushing level 2 beneath it. The shock spread upward, causing cracks to race through the supports of level 4. The entire left side of the fortress began folding inward in a strangely graceful collapse, like a slow-motion landslide designed by an engineer. Emma was not finished, yet her father had always said that a demolition was not complete until every remaining point of resistance had been addressed. She lined up her fifth shot, striking a hidden brace that enemy fighters had not realized was critical. The sixth followed quickly, severing a beam that supported the opposite side. The seventh and final shot was a clean strike through a reinforced anchor buried in shadow. With that final shot, the right side of the fortress surrendered to gravity, and the whole structure crumbled into a heap of broken stone and splintered beams. It had taken just under 30 seconds. The impregnable enemy stronghold that had resisted every weapon they had thrown at it now lay in ruins. Without the massive explosions of artillery, there had been no uncontrolled rockslide, no danger to the American forces' position below, only the precision of calculated destruction. Over the radio came the colonel's voice, carrying disbelief and admiration. He asked how she had known where to shoot. Emma's hands were steady as she began packing away her rifle. The answer was simple. My father taught me, sir. He told me every fortress was just an engineering problem waiting for the right solution. From the other end came a pause, then the voice of Major Sophia Lane, tinged with realization. She understood now. Emma confirmed her suspicion. Ghost Roberts had been her father, and he had developed the techniques that few in the military had ever mastered, techniques that used the smallest amount of force for the greatest possible effect. She explained that he had trained her not just to be a sniper, but to think like an engineer too. See the battlefield as a network of interlocking problems with hidden solutions. As she started the trek back toward their forward operating base, the mountain behind her was quiet now, its echo of gunfire replaced by the sound of rock settling into its new shape. The mission had shifted from survival to victory in less than a minute, and she knew her father's teachings had made it possible. Emma moved down the rocky slope with practiced care, each step chosen to avoid loose shale or the jagged edges that could slice through her gear. The adrenaline had begun to fade, replaced by a deep and steady satisfaction, not of triumph over an enemy, but of solving a problem that had seemed impossible moments earlier. That fortress had been a symbol of impassable defense. Now it was nothing more than rubble scattered across the mountain face. She paused halfway down to glance back. The collapsed structure looked almost peaceful in the distance, a strange contrast to the chaos it had caused only minutes before. Dust drifted lazily in the thin air, catching the sunlight and giving the impression of smoke from a long, extinguished fire. The enemy fighters who had survived were scattering their defensive line, broken beyond repair. Her earpiece crackled to life with the voice of Colonel John Mitchell, sounding half awed and half incredulous. He said they had just witnessed the impossible and demanded to know how she had done it. Emma kept moving, her tone steady, as she replied that her father had taught her everything. She explained that he had believed every defensive position was a puzzle, and every puzzle had a solution if you learned to see it from the right angle. A silence followed her words, the kind of silence that meant every operator on the frequency was listening. Major Sophia Lane broke it with a voice carrying sudden understanding. She asked if her father had been Robert Ghost Roberts. Emma confirmed it, and the airwaves went still again. Ghost Roberts was a name that carried weight among special operations forces. Even years after his death, his legend was built not just on his unmatched skill as a sniper, but on his ability to dismantle the strongest fortifications without ever placing a single charge. By the time Emma reached the forward operating base, the air was buzzing with the story of what she had done. Soldiers nodded to her as she passed, some with open admiration, others with quiet disbelief. She had barely stepped inside the command tent when Colonel Mitchell gestured her toward the main radio console. He He said there was someone who wanted to speak with her, someone important. The next voice was crisp and authoritative, but unfamiliar. Sergeant Roberts, this is General Michael Hayes, Special Operations Command. I worked alongside your father during the development of his precision demolition techniques. Emma froze for the briefest moment, feeling the weight of the name. She knew of General Hayes, a figure often mentioned in the same sentences as the most classified operations of the last decade. Emma greeted him with respect. The general did not waste time on pleasantries. He told her that what she had accomplished was more than just impressive marksmanship. She had executed techniques that the Pentagon had spent years trying to recreate since her father's passing. The problem, he said, was that no one else had ever truly understood the principles behind them until now. Emma found a quiet corner away from the noise of the base and keyed her radio. She explained that her father had spent years teaching her to think like an engineer, that he had told her shooting was simply mathematics. Made visible, the general's voice softened just slightly as he said her father had been right, but added that Robert had also been protecting something of extraordinary value. The methods she had just used represented a revolutionary way to solve battlefield problems without overwhelming force. Instead, they used understanding and precision, turning the battlefield into a chessboard where the smallest move could decide the outcome. She could hear faint voices in the background on the general's end, muffled but urgent enough to suggest high-level listeners. Hayes continued, saying that the Pentagon wanted to offer her a position in their Advanced Tactical Development Program. The techniques could save countless lives if they could be passed on to other operators. He told her that with the right training, teams could neutralize threats without the heavy costs of traditional assault. Emma thought of her father's words spoken on the night before his last mission. He had told her he was not teaching her to fight wars, but to end them, that if she ever found herself in a position to save lives with what he had taught her, she must take it. She considered the offer carefully. Her instinct was to stay in the field using the techniques where soldiers needed them most. She told the general exactly that, and he said he understood, but asked if she would be willing to train others so the knowledge would not be lost again. Emma looked out beyond the tent, toward the mountains, now quiet. The memory of the 17 soldiers who had died before she acted was still fresh in her mind. She imagined a future where others could act as she had, where impossible fortresses would fall without sacrificing lives. She told the general yes, she would teach others, because that was exactly what her father would have wanted. The conversation ended with a promise from Hayes that arrangements would be made within days. She would begin preparations for the first official training course in precision demolition. That night, Emma lay awake in her bunk, staring at the canvas ceiling above her. The sounds of the camp were familiar, the distant rumble of generators, the soft murmur of night guards talking near the perimeter, but her mind was elsewhere, wandered back to the dusty shooting range where her father had shown her how to break down a structure's strength into numbers and lines. She remembered how he would nod with quiet approval when she solved a problem on her own. He had never raised his voice, never rushed her. Learning every lesson had been about patience and trust. In the morning, she would wake not as just another sniper, but as the keeper of a rare and dangerous knowledge, a knowledge that, if shared wisely, could change the way battles were fought. She knew the path ahead would not be easy. The military would want results quickly, and some would doubt her methods, but she also knew the power of what her father had passed on, and she was determined to see it used for the right reasons. 6 months later, the air at the Special Operations Training Center carried the scent of dry earth and oil from the firing ranges. A faint haze of heat shimmered above the packed dirt as Emma Phantom Roberts stood in front of a semicircle of soldiers. Their uniforms were varied, some from different branches of service, others from allied nations, brought in for joint training. The men and women before her had been told only that they were here to learn a new method of neutralizing hardened positions, and they looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Emma wore no special insignia beyond her rank stripes, but her presence carried quiet authority. She began walking slowly before the group, each step deliberate, as she explained that they were not here to simply improve marksmanship. They were here to learn how to think differently, to see the battlefield as a living structure of strengths and weaknesses. She told them that a defensive position was never truly indestructible. It was only as strong as its weakest point, and those points could be found if you learned where to look. One soldier with broad shoulders and a shaved head crossed his arms and asked how any sniper could possibly destroy something designed to withstand artillery. Emma paused, meeting his gaze, and then gestured toward a nearby structure built for the course. It looked solid, its walls made of reinforced panels, and its firing ports shielded with thick steel. She invited the group to study it for a few minutes. Then she asked them to point out which parts they thought could be targeted to bring the whole thing down. The guesses came quickly. Aim for the largest, opening fire at the center, use explosives when all else fails. Emma listened, then shook her head. She knelt in the dirt and began sketching in the dust with the tip of a stick, tracing lines from one side of the model fortress to the other. She showed them how load-bearing beams carried weight into specific anchor points. She pointed out where human modification had weakened the original design and where supports intersected in ways that created stress concentrations. When she straightened again, she told them that her father, Robert Ghost Roberts, had taught her to see every defensive structure like a puzzle. One shot at the wrong place might do nothing, but the right shot could set off a chain reaction that would tear the whole thing apart. She saw a few heads tilt in interest, though others still wore expressions of doubt. The first exercise was simple. Each soldier would take a turn behind a rifle and try to hit a visible target, but rather than aiming for the center, Emma had marked several small areas on the structure with chalk barely larger than a coin. These represented the structural weak points. She explained that hitting these would not be easy. The shots required exact calculation of distance, wind, and angle, but more importantly, they required the shooter to understand why that point mattered. As the soldiers took turns, most missed entirely. A few struck close, but not close enough to count. Emma offered no criticism, only asked them what they had seen through their scopes and how they had judged their aim. Slowly, they began to realize that this training was as much about observation as it was about shooting. The more they studied the structure, the more details they began to notice: small shadows where beams met the wall, subtle shifts in the way panels joined together. During a break, Emma stood by the shade of the range, shelter her eyes, scanning the horizon. The base was surrounded by dry hills and scrub trees, the sun beating down without mercy. She remembered her father standing with her in similar heat at their private range. His voice had been calm, steady, as he told her that the battlefield was a conversation. Every shot was a sentence, and if you understood the language, you could speak directly to the heart of a structure. When training resumed, she added movement to the challenge. The soldiers now had to relocate after each shot, finding a new firing position, while keeping the sequence of targets in mind. The first few attempts were clumsy and uncoordinated, but by the third run, there was a visible shift. They began working with intent, covering each other, moving in patterns that mirrored her own field experience. By the end of the day, the chalk marks on the practice structure were worn and smudged from repeated hits. The group gathered around as Emma reviewed the sequence they had been practicing. She described what would happen if this had been a real enemy position, how the collapse would begin, and how it would travel through the structure. She reminded them that this was not about destruction for its own sake, but about creating the minimum force necessary to end a threat and save lives. One younger soldier approached her as the others dispersed. He admitted he had not believed a word of the briefing before the course began, but now he could see how precision could achieve what brute force could not. Emma smiled faintly and told him that her father had faced the same doubts when he first developed the techniques, but the battlefield had a way of proving their value. That night, Emma walked the perimeter of the training center alone. The sky above was deep and full of stars, the air cooler now that the sun had set. She thought about the responsibility she carried, not just to pass on her father's methods, but to instill in these soldiers the mindset that would let them adapt those methods to any situation. She knew that someday, soon, one of them might find themselves staring at an enemy fortress with no hope of an assault, and that the memory of this training might turn the tide. In the quiet, she could almost hear Robert's voice telling her that precision was a kind of respect for the physics that governed the world, respect for the lives you were trying to protect, and respect for the fact that on the battlefield, the smallest action could hold the greatest power. The sun was only a faint glow on the horizon when Emma Phantom Roberts led her group toward the far edge of the training grounds. The air was cool and heavy with the smell of dust rising from the tracks of armored vehicles. A wide valley stretched ahead, its floor broken by jagged ridges and scattered clusters of stone. that looked like natural formations, but hid something far more deliberate. This was the advanced simulation field, a place designed to test the limits of even the most experienced special operations teams. The instructors had built an enemy fortress here using reinforced concrete steel braces and concealed firing positions. It was modeled after real fortifications encountered in combat, complete with interlocking fields of fire and hidden escape routes. The difference was that this one would fire only simulated rounds, but every other challenge would be real. The soldiers stood in a loose formation studying the valley. Emma watched their eyes, scanning for obvious weaknesses, and finding none. One of them muttered that the structure looked unbreakable. She said nothing, yet simply motioned for them to follow her along a narrow path that curved up the side of a rocky hill. From here, the entire layout came into view. The mock fortress sat embedded into a slope, just like the one she had faced months earlier in Afghanistan. Its lines were clean, its angles sharp, and its openings minimal. She let them look for a while before kneeling in the dirt and drawing another of her simple diagrams. This time, she did not tell them where the weak points were. She only reminded them of the principles they had been learning over the past weeks. Every beam carried weight into something else. Every cut made for a weapon position weakened something behind it. Every surface told a story, if you were patient enough to read it. Their task was simple in theory: identify the structural vulnerabilities, then coordinate fire to bring the whole thing down in the shortest possible time. They would have no explosives, only their rifles and the knowledge they had been building since day one. The simulation would begin the moment the first shot was fired, and from that point forward, the defenders inside would react with speed and aggression. Emma gave them a final look, as if to measure whether they were ready. Then she moved to a higher position to observe, not as a participant, but as a silent witness, to see if her teaching could stand on its own. The signal was given, and the first team slid into position low against the ridge. A moment later, the sharp crack of a rifle broke the morning air, followed almost immediately by the rattling burst of return fire from the fortress. Through her binoculars, Emma watched as the first target beam shattered. The collapse was small, only a section of an overhang shifting slightly, but she could see the defenders inside adjusting their positions. The team did not hesitate, moving to their next target as planned shots rang out in steady rhythm, each one aimed at a precise point marked earlier in their minds. She felt a quiet pride in their composure under fire. The defenders were aggressive, shifting angles and trying to pin the team down, but the soldiers had learned mobility from her. They relocated after nearly every shot, forcing the defenders to reacquire them again and again. Their timing was improving. 2-1 shot will be followed almost instantly by another from a different position, multiplying the effect of each strike on the structure's stability. Then came the moment she had been waiting for. The fourth shot severed a load-bearing post that had been hidden in shadow until the sun rose high enough to reveal it. The crack echoed across the valley, and the section above it sagged. Visibly, a cheer rose from one of the shooters, but the rest kept focus, pressing the attack with calculated precision. The defenders' return fire grew frantic. Dust began to swirl around the base of the fortress as its upper levels shifted under the growing stress. A long beam on the right side buckled after a hit from a second team, and the sound carried up to her observation point like a groan from deep inside the earth. Emma knew the end was close, but the team still had to finish the sequence. 2 final shots landed in quick succession, striking the last supports, holding the central structure intact. The collapse that followed was almost identical to the real one she had created months earlier. Stone and concrete folded inward in a controlled chain reaction. The simulation system registered the structure as neutralized, and a loud tone signaled the end of the exercise. The soldiers emerged from cover flushed with adrenaline. They spoke quickly to each other, replaying the sequence shot by shot. One pointed at the rubble and said he could hardly believe they had brought it down without a single explosive. Another laughed, saying he would never look at a building the same way again. Emma walked toward them, her expression calm, but her eyes bright. She told them they had done well, not because they had followed her instructions exactly, but because they had adapted to the situation in real time. That, she said, was the mark of a true operator. Back at the debriefing tent, she stood before the group and went over each phase of the attack. She pointed out where their timing had been perfect and where they had risked exposing themselves too long. She explained how the defenders had reacted and how their movement had kept the advantage. She ended with a reminder that in a real mission, lives would depend on their ability to stay disciplined under pressure. When the debrief ended, the group lingered longer than usual. Some asked about her father and how he had come up with the techniques. Others simply thanked her for the training. Emma answered each question with patience, knowing that curiosity meant the lessons were sinking, and she told them that Robert had never claimed to invent something new, only to see something others had missed and to trust in the mathematics of physics to do the work. That night, as the camp settled into quiet, Emma sat outside her quarters, looking across the valley. The fortress was gone, replaced by a mound of debris, glowing faintly in the moonlight. The exercise had proven the point, but she knew the real test would come when these soldiers faced a live enemy. And remembered what they had learned here. She hoped they would carry not just the skill, but the philosophy with them into the field, because precision without purpose was nothing more than noise on the wind. The air was thick with heat and the smell of diesel as the convoy wound its way through a narrow valley somewhere in a region where the mountains rose like jagged teeth against the sky. Emma Phantom Roberts rode in the lead vehicle, her rifle resting beside her, but her main role this time was not as the one behind the scope. She was here as an advisor to a mixed unit of operators, some of whom she had trained herself. Among them was Staff Sergeant Daniel Price, one of her best students, a calm thinker with steady hands. Daniel had shown from the beginning an ability to see the hidden skeleton of any structure. Today, that skill was about to be tested. The mission was to clear a fortified checkpoint blocking a vital supply route. Intelligence reported that the position had been reinforced with both concrete and steel, making it resistant to direct artillery strikes. Worse, it overlooked a narrow choke point, which meant any assault would be met with concentrated fire. Emma had been asked to observe and assist in planning, but the actual operation would be led by Daniel. This was his proving ground. She had given him the same advice her father had given her: know the outcome before you pull the trigger. The moment the convoy stopped, Daniel moved with quiet efficiency, setting up his observation point behind a rocky outcrop, while Emma stayed back with the command element, watching through her own scope. Through the glass, the fortress came into focus. It was perched on a low rise with its lower levels cut into the slope, just enough to give defenders cover from direct fire. Two heavy weapon nests guarded the main approach, and smaller firing ports dotted the upper walls. Emma recognized the design. It was similar to fortifications she had studied with her father and later used in her training courses. She knew there would be weak points hidden in the seams between natural terrain and man-made reinforcement. Daniel began directing his spotters and shooters into position. His voice over the comms was steady, giving precise adjustments for wind and angle. The first target was a narrow beam supporting an overhanging observation platform. One shot, and it was gone. The structure sagged slightly, but held the defenders inside, shifted their fire patterns, trying to locate the shooters, but the team had already moved. The second and third shots came from different positions, striking supports on the opposite side of the platform. Dust drifted down from above, signaling that the load was beginning to shift. The defenders reacted with bursts of fire toward where they thought the threat was, but each burst landed seconds too late. Daniel's shooters were gone before they could be fixed in place. Emma kept her eyes on the bigger picture. She could see Daniel working the sequence in his mind the same way she had done in the mountains months earlier. His fourth shot targeted a metal joint hidden behind a slatted cover. The sound of its failure carried faintly even over the gunfire. The overhanging platform gave way, partially crumbling and sending debris down the slope. The defenders scrambled to adjust, but Daniel pressed the attack. His fifth shot severed the main brace, holding up the right flank of the checkpoint. The collapse was not total yet, but the position was starting to fold inward. The defenders' fields of fire narrowed, forcing them into less advantageous angles. Emma could see the tension in their movement, even from a distance. The sixth and seventh shots came in quick succession, aimed at the structural seams connecting the central tower to its lower levels. These were transition zones where natural rock met reinforced concrete, and they had always been the weakest points. The moment those seams cracked, the weight above shifted dramatically. A deep groan echoed from the fortress, followed by a cloud of dust as the tower leaned and then collapsed into the lower level. Emma heard the voice of the ground commander over the comms, saying the position was broken and assault teams were moving in by the time they reached the remains of the checkpoint. Resistance had collapsed entirely. The defenders, who were still able, had fled, leaving behind weapons and supplies. The route was open without the need for a costly frontal assault. Daniel returned from his position, walking with the slow, measured pace of someone who had just experienced the first real test of his skills. Emma met him near the vehicles. She told him he had done well, but more importantly, that he had understood the problem before acting. He smiled faintly and said he had only done what she had taught him. She replied that he had done more than that. He had proven the philosophy worked even when she was not the one pulling the trigger. Back at the temporary command post, the after-action review began. Officers and specialists examined the remains of the checkpoint, noting the precision of the damage. One engineer commented that the collapse pattern looked almost deliberate, as if it had been designed by someone who understood the structure from the inside. Emma simply said that was the point. Later that night, Emma found herself standing alone outside the camp. The sky above was wide and full of stars, and the air had cooled enough to carry the scent of distant rain. She thought of her father and how proud he would have been to see his methods living on in others. She also thought of the fact that the battle had been won with minimal destruction to the surrounding terrain and without the loss of friendly lives. That was the true measure of success. She knew there would be more missions, more opportunities for her students to prove themselves, and she also knew that each time one of them did, it would carry a little more of Ghost Robert's legacy into the future, not as a memory of a single man, but as a living skill passed from one soldier to another until it became part of how battles were fought. The Special Operations Training Center buzzed with activity under the sharp light of midday. The scent of hot metal and dust hung in the air, while the sound of rifles cracked in deliberate rhythm. Emma Phantom Roberts stood near the edge of the ranger, stance relaxed, but her gaze sharp. This was her third full class since the program began, and she could already see the same shift in their posture and eyes that she had once seen in herself. Since the day Daniel Price had proven the method in a live mission, word had spread far beyond their own units. Commanders from across different branches and allied forces had begun sending select soldiers to learn her techniques. The requests often came with skepticism, as if her approach was a curious experiment. But more and more those doubts were being replaced with respect. The battlefield was proving the value of precision over brute force. The drill today was a culmination exercise. A mock enemy fortress had been built into a section of canyon wall, complete with reinforced beams, hidden bracing, and false targets. The soldiers were tasked with identifying the weak points, creating a firing plan, and executing it under the pressure of simulated return fire. Emma walked among them quietly as they studied the structure. Some traced the lines with their scopes, others sketched rough diagrams in the dirt. She stopped beside one soldier who seemed hesitant. His aim was fixed on a large brace near the top, but his brow furrowed with uncertainty. Emma crouched beside him and asked what he saw. He explained the brace looked important, but something about the way it connected to the rest of the wall made him unsure. She told him to follow the load in his mind from that brace down into the lower supports, to imagine where the real pressure was flowing. Slowly his aim shifted to a shadowed, seem almost invisible. Without patience, she gave a small nod, then moved on. The exercise began with short, deliberate shots. Dust bloomed with each strike, and the soldiers moved immediately to new firing positions. Just as they had trained, the defenders inside the fortress reacted quickly, returning fire in bursts, but the shooters never stayed long enough to be pinned. Each shot had a purpose, and each purpose was part of a chain. Emma could see the structure bending toward collapse, not in chaos, but in an orderly surrender to gravity. When the final brace failed, the facade folded inward in a slow, controlled fall. The tone, signaling mission success, echoed across the range, and the teams emerged from cover, some grinning with relief, others wearing the thoughtful expression of those replaying each decision in their minds. Emma gathered them under the shade and reviewed their performance. She pointed out where their timing had been perfect and where they had lingered too long. She reminded them that in the field, hesitation could cost lives, but rushing without thought could cost just as much. Before dismissing them, she spoke of the deeper reason behind the method. She told them it was not about destroying structures, but about solving problems with the smallest force needed to save lives, that each target was part of a bigger picture, and that understanding the picture was the true skill her father Robert, Ghost Robert, had taught her that lesson, not to win wars, but to prevent unnecessary loss. As they dispersed, Emma remained for a moment looking at the rubble of the mock fortress. The wind carried the faint scent of dust and oil, and she thought of her father's handwritten note tucked safely in her quarters, a reminder that precision was not about power, but about understanding. That was the legacy she carried now, and the one she intended to leave behind, a legacy not of destruction, but of seeing solutions where others saw only obstacles. That evening, as the sun dipped low over the hills, Emma sat alone at the edge of the training grounds. The sky above streaked in gold and deep red. She let the quiet settle around her and thought of the day in the Afghan mountains when everything had begun, when the voice of her father had been as real in her mind as the rifle in her hands. She understood now that his lessons were never just about hitting a target, but about seeing the world as a set of solvable problems. Every beam, every wall, every fortress was a reminder that strength was often an illusion waiting for the right mind to see its flaw. She smiled, faintly knowing that the knowledge was no longer hers alone, but lived on in every soldier who would one day stand where she had stood and find a way to bring their people home alive.